Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th with an interview with Middle East analyst Tony Badran. What happened in Israel on October 7th was not an aberration or merely the work of Palestinian Arab extremists. It was the logical consequence of a century of rhetoric and policy on the part of those who believe the Jewish presence in Israel must be eliminated. That's not the narrative about this conflict from much of the corporate liberal media. After decades of telling us that all Israel had to do to achieve peace was to make itself more vulnerable, to make concessions, and to empower those who had repeatedly sworn to destroy it, the atrocities committed by Hamas terrorists who entered Israel to murder, rape, and kidnap Israeli civilians is often explained as the result of their frustration and yearning for independence. But as the gruesome and barbaric crimes committed by Hamas are revealed, what is needed is for the world to finally understand that the conflict is not about territory or Palestinian self-determination, let alone a struggle for human rights. To the contrary, this attack, carefully planned and reportedly coordinated with and assisted by Iran, is a manifestation of hatred for Jews and a desire to shed Jewish blood and to humiliate and degrade the Jewish people. It is rooted not merely in their support for armed struggle against Israel, as opposed to negotiations, as it is in a belief that even after 75 years of Jewish sovereignty, the Jews can be scared into leaving their land and accepting that Arabs will not accept even that small sliver of the Middle East being a non-Muslim country. In the worldview of the Palestinian Arabs, even one small Jewish state on the planet is one too many, and there is no limit to the amount of Jewish blood that they are prepared to spill in order to wipe it out. And that is why they carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. The Western mind, and especially enlightened liberal Jewish opinion, recoils against such a conclusion. Such a desire on the part of Palestinians is not reasonable. Surely most Palestinians merely want to live in peace with their neighbors, and it is just a few bad people on both sides who have created and perpetuated this conflict. And no doubt, some, maybe even many Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, who are about to once again pay the price for the crimes of their Islamist overlords, would agree with that. But since Palestinian national identity is inextricably bound up with the century-old war on Zionism and its political culture, has valorized the shedding of Jewish blood as the highest value and the greatest indication of credibility, pretending that terrorism is alien to their mindset is a Western delusion and not an indication of sophisticated analysis. What Hamas has done in the last week is to remind the world and the Jewish people that would rather not confront that reality is that the conflict with the Palestinians is existential. The goal of Hamas and the other Palestinian national and terror groups is not to adjust Israel's borders or to change its policies, but to destroy it and to slaughter its Jewish population. Any discussion of the conflict that is not predicated on accepting this is, however well-meaning and desirous of peace it may be, a dangerous fantasy that does more to deceive us about the nature of this war than anything else. At this moment in time, as the bodies of Israeli men, women, and children are being found in the communities along the border with Gaza, and the horrifying images of the murders and the abuse of captives are being shown, the world is sympathizing with the Jews. As we've long known, the world loves dead Jews. The question is whether that sympathy and support will continue in the coming days, as hopefully Israel begins the difficult but necessary task of eliminating Hamas from Gaza and ensuring that the terrorists will never again have the ability to threaten Israel, let alone repeat these atrocities. Time will tell whether the Biden administration which has done so much to convince both Iran and the Palestinians that Israel can be pressured into making concessions, will wake up and realize that recent events require a whole new way of thinking? Will they accept that the conventional wisdom about the need for a two-state solution and forcing Israel back to the 67 borders that the foreign policy establishment has promoted has always been a mistake? If not, and I'm deeply skeptical about the willingness of the so-called experts who have been continually wrong about the Middle East to admit their mistakes, then nothing will change, and Israel and the West must accept that the Hamas atrocities of October 7th will be repeated. But for those of us who are not so committed to these follies, this is a moment to speak up and demand that the West support Israel's campaign against Hamas to its logical conclusion, no matter how much they complain about the humanitarian crisis that Hamas has created or how many of the human shields they deploy to protect themselves are harmed. As with the fight against al-Qaeda and ISIS, the battle against the Palestinians and their terrorist groups is not one that can be resolved by compromise or sweet reason. And it is the duty of every decent person, be they Jewish or non-Jewish, to not merely express sympathy for the people of Israel and to pray for peace, but to advocate for the extirpation of Hamas and the other terrorist groups, and to absolutely reject any outcome that will leave them in place or allow them to claim any political benefit from their crimes. Anything less will be a betrayal of the memory of those slain and an invitation to further bloodshed. To discuss this situation, and in particular the role played by Iran, and in the broader context of the conflict, we're fortunate to have with us today someone deeply versed in the subject and among the most insightful writers about geopolitics of the region. Tony Badran is a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, where he focuses on Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, and the geopolitics of the Levant. Born and raised in Lebanon, his research focuses on the relationship between Iran's Hezbollah model and the regional states, as well as the history of and future scenarios for Israel-Hezbollah wars. His writings have appeared in publications including The Wall Street Journal, The Los Angeles Times, The Washington Post, New York Post, Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs. And he's a columnist for Tablet magazine. Tony Badran, welcome to Top Story.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Tony, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. Obviously, when we first spoke about having you come on the show, we had no idea that we'd be speaking only days after Hamas launched a war against Israel and carried out mass atrocities. You're an expert about the politics of Lebanon and Syria, in which Iran plays a major role. Can you tell us what you know about the role that Iran might have played in aiding this attack and place it in the broader context of the regional conflict?
Sure. So the immediate context for this actually stretches back to 2021, to the last Gaza war, subsequent to which the Iranians and Hezbollah, through their own media mouthpieces in Lebanon, published and gloated about having established a joint operations room overseen by the IRGC with Hezbollah and the Palestinian factions in Lebanon that oversaw the war in Gaza in 2021. And it was in that war that the Iranians and Hezbollah set a new framework for how they deal with the Palestinian arena. This was right after the Biden administration had returned. You had 4 years of quiet, and then now they saw that there's a new possibility to push, make a counter push to the prevailing to the previous 4 years and the prevailing
the
policy.
4 years, I guess, of the Trump administration is what
That's
you're
correct.
referring to.
That's correct. And so they decided now is they're going to impose a new set of rules out of Lebanon. Now, it's important to understand why Lebanon, they felt secure that they can do this out of Lebanon. And that too has to do with U.S. policy. U.S. policy has viewed Lebanon, and this developed, by the way, especially in 2022 and 2023, but we'll get to that in a second. U.S. policy more broadly in Lebanon has been to recognize Lebanon as an Iranian holding. And at the same time...
And essentially legitimize their role there.
Absolutely. And that was the next point I was going to make, that it's the idea was to extend a U.S. protective umbrella over Lebanon, that Lebanon somehow should be sidelined from any whatever confrontation Israel and Iran were having in the region. You can bomb in Syria and you can do all of that, but leave Lebanon aside. Now, this jived well with a prevailing sentiment that has to do with Israeli doctrine that preferred to forestall any major conflagration in Lebanon. So they were happy to play along with this and to strictly focus on Syria if possible. So Hezbollah had both these things working to its advantage, and it decided to push the envelope to extend this protective umbrella to its activities with the Palestinians without having to face consequences from Israel. This policy, this U.S. policy, then accelerated in 2022 with the maritime border delineation deal, where the administration pursuing what it called a policy of regional integration, which is basically code for propping up Iranian equities and entangling U.S. allies with them, and in the case of wherever possible, to quote-unquote de-escalate any fighting between Iranian assets in those places and U.S. allies, be it Saudi Arabia in Yemen or Israel in Lebanon. So they saw the entangling of Israel with Lebanon as a further guarantee of security and stability for Lebanon, meaning less likely for Israel than to take action in Lebanon. So again, it's a protective umbrella. And they, the way the maritime deal worked out amplified Hezbollah's sense of this protection, because they launched drones against the Karish rig. The United States, instead of
the natural gas exploitation that takes place
correct.
along
the offshore, the offshore platform. And the U.S., instead of halting the negotiations at the time, actually pressed on Israel to de-escalate, continue the talks, in fact, finish it quickly before the Lapid government had to face elections. So they did that. They gave Hezbollah everything they wanted from that. So that was a big data point for Hezbollah. In addition, Hezbollah then had started from 21 and now again accelerating. They had started testing out the possibility of launching rockets from Lebanon without claiming responsibility for them and letting the Israelis then speculate that it might be Palestinians, who knows, and see if what the Israeli reaction to that would be. That kind of passed. The maritime deal took over. Then we reached 2023 when they did it again. And now they did it in much larger numbers. Now there are more rocket attacks in the spring of 2023. Then you had more escalation. Now you had a bomber that was dispatched from Lebanon to hit the Megiddo Junction in Israel. So now you're not only firing rockets, now you are dispatching operatives across the border into Israel, all under the sort of the Palestinian umbrella of Palestinian affairs, Palestinian terrorist attacks against Israel. So all of this was happening while the American policy of protection in Lebanon was ongoing. And this led also to Hezbollah then taking the last step that they took prior to this conflagration, which is to move in the Hardov region in the so-called Sheba farms. So now they moved and they set up this outpost across the border in the Golan Heights. And as Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, was candidly explained, that they did so with the expectation that the Americans would now come and they would do a repeat of what happened with the maritime border, which is exactly what happened. So the Americans come in, instead of siding with Israel, to end this violation, they amplified the operation, Hezbollah's operation, told Israel to stand down, don't escalate. We will resolve this for you through a process. Then they upped the ante some more. Then they went to the Security Council in August, and they voted for language that described the Shebaa Farms as, which is part of, again, for your listeners who don't know, Shebaa Farms is part of the Golan Heights, okay? It's not part of Lebanon. Nobody recognizes it as part of Lebanon. Not even the United Nations recognizes it as part of Lebanon. The United States voted for language that described the Shebaa Farms as occupied. This is in the Security Council that was passed on August 31st, resolution on August 31st to renew the mandate of the UN force in Lebanon. So this was unprecedented. No U.S. administration had ever voted for this, let alone after the Trump administration recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. So in so doing, the Biden administration was effectively reversing the policy of recognition of sovereignty over the Golan, which again only emboldened Hezbollah. And then we find out after, not to toot my own horn, but I wrote the article exposing what had happened. And then after that, the administration was forced to answer questions on it. Initially, they said there's no change in policy. And then after that, they revealed that, in fact, Amos Hochstein may very well propose that Israel withdraw from that and hand it over to Lebanon. So because Amos Hochstein was, again, back there to try to resolve the border dispute, the land border dispute. So
Hochstein being a Biden administration
the special
official.
envoy for, I think, security infrastructure, energy infrastructure or something. Anyway, so you had all of these policies in addition to funding the Lebanese security organs whose job is to collect or run counterintelligence against Israeli spy networks in Lebanon. So the United States was simultaneously funding Hezbollah counterintelligence, simultaneously protecting Hezbollah through these maritime deals and the border delineation deal, enhancing its position by forcing Israel to concede now territory in the Golan. And all of this is happening at a time when Hezbollah is, with that joint operations room that was revealed in 2021, preparing the Hamas attack in Gaza, which, as we know from the Wall Street Journal recent report, that's exactly what happened. It was this joint operations room that planned this in Lebanon and then executed it. So while this was being planned, the United States policy in Lebanon was basically to lull Israel into a sense of, or just to tie it down in a bunch of processes with Hezbollah and sort of lower the level of alertness and readiness. And then eventually you see a major, what appears to be a major intelligence breach and or failure, and then followed by what looks also potentially like some sort of a hack that was able to blind the sort of technological instruments that Israel, the sensors and that Israel uses along the fence and so on. But interestingly, if you look actually in July, to go back to that joint operations room, and so if you looked in July, Hezbollah released a video of its own fighters, a scenario of its own fighters potentially breaching the border into Israel from the north. And if you look at that video, you can see stark tactical similarities to what was employed by Hamas in the south. So you see immediately the joint tactics that are developed under Iranian guidance, even the use of drones to target the Merkava tank. All of these things, all of these elements are present in the video. And so the idea of this joint training and this being a joint operation, the elements of it are present everywhere for people to see.
Well, I guess what you're setting us up with is that essentially Western policies toward Iran, as well as the Palestinians and the Hezbollah, have played a role in making Hamas and its allies think that they could profit from a new war, haven't they?
Well, I mean, the Biden administration has spent the last few days defending, really,
it's a hostage ransom payment of billions of dollars, pretending that it had nothing to do with what's happened. But I guess what the context that you've given us shows us that basically, the Biden administration has been coddling Iran and its auxiliaries in Lebanon, whom they must have known are coordinating with Hamas.
Yes, so that's an interesting thing. The messaging on that latter point has been very interesting because at first, and they continue, incidentally, to deny direct Iranian involvement. Right.
Yeah, so Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been at pains to try to make this point, even though basically everything we've learned about this would lead us to the opposite conclusion.
Correct. So they'll resort to generalities. Well, of course, yes, this is a long-standing relationship, and yes, of course, we know that they give them support and whatever. However, we don't know if Iran has a direct role in this operation. So they are deliberately sort of acting like Iran's lawyer on this part because they are defending their own policy, which is a policy of support and realignment with the Iranian forces in the region, and the end result of which is the mass slaughter of Jews. And that is a big stain, right? Because now you see that that's what this policy that was initiated by Barack Obama of further aligning the U.S. with Iran and away from traditional allies and towards Iran. Now, under the Biden administration, it has taken on a new name. They call it regional integration, right? We want to have an integrated Middle East. Well, whom are you integrating? Oh, everybody. So what are the examples you're giving? Oh, here's the examples. It's Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Saudi Arabia and Iraq, Israel and Lebanon. What's the common denominator between Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon? These are all Iranian holdings. So when the administration talks about an integrated region, it wants people to associate that with Saudi-Israeli peace talks or Arab-Israeli peace talks. But the actual concrete examples that it provides for that regional integration are Iranian holdings with U.S. allies, Saudi and Israeli. The maritime deal with Israel, for instance, was explicitly described by the White House as a prime example of regional integration. Whom did you integrate? Israel and Hezbollah? That's a regional integration.
Well, I think to put it in, a very broad and important context, I guess the question, and there are a number of questions, but the first one I'm going to ask, deriving from this, is have they, by starting a new war, have they essentially, at least postponed, if not ended, the possibility of broader normalization expanding the Abraham Accords?
Well, first of all, they weren't expanding the Abraham Accords. Right?
Yes, the Biden administration couldn't even say the words Abraham Accords
Correct.
For the first couple of years, but they had been making, noises in that direction in the last few months, although I think dangerously trying to involve the Palestinians in it. But obviously, Iran and its auxiliaries want to end this altogether.
Well, you just said it, right? you're describing the Abraham Accords on the one hand, and then you're describing what the Biden administration was pursuing. And then what the Biden administration was pursuing involves the putting back the Palestinians in center stage, involves integration with Iranian equities. In other words, it's the actual inversion of the Abraham Accord. It's the exact opposite of the Abraham Accord. The Abraham Accord was that we sideline the Palestinians, right? And we draw a line in the region between the U.S.-led camp with its Arab and Israeli components on the one side, and the Iranian camp on the other. That was a clear distinction. We were pursuing that in tandem with a policy of maximum pressure against the Iranians, of sanctions against the Iranians, of even targeting the Iranian terror master, Qasem Soleimani. And then in addition to that, we are putting our house in order on the Arab and Israeli side and removing the Palestinian veto, which was used always by radical regimes precisely to sabotage Arab-Israeli bilateral peace agreements. Okay? So if this is what the Abraham Accords were about, to come in and reinsert the Palestinian veto, reinsert the 1967 lines as a major platform for the Obama administration, which, in case if your viewers don't know, Barack Obama, in his final hours in office, his signature move before leaving was to pass and orchestrate the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which adopted the so-called 1967 lines, which means that the United States now adopted the view that Israeli communities anywhere beyond the 1967 lines were illegitimate. Okay,
including Jerusalem, yes,
including East Jerusalem, which why incidentally they were very happy to reverse the Golan recognition, and which is why they have been insistent on opening a Palestinian consulate in East Jerusalem, as they specified, very much so. Jake Sullivan specified that we would like to see it in East Jerusalem. So all of these things were reintroduced now under the guise of a Saudi-Israeli track, okay? And that happened only after the Saudis were forced to make some sort of a détente with the Iranians as well, and after the Israelis were forced to make their maritime agreement with Hezbollah. So after you've already forced them into the new framework of regional integration, now you're using the Saudi track as a device to then push forward with the Palestinian material. So to my mind, this wasn't a continuation of the Abraham Accords at all. It was actually an inversion of it. And part of what it did was to, again, like with all of the other processes that they wanted to do in Lebanon, was to further bog down and tie down the Israelis. And all of this was, as all of this was happening, in Lebanon, this U.S. protectorate, plans were being made for a major operation in Gaza. So to me, the Saudi track, in the end, was a catastrophic distraction in that regard. Leaving aside all of the other elements of it that I think are completely opposite to what we had wanted to achieve with the Abraham Accords. But there's another practical element, is that it actually ends up being a distraction that has had catastrophic results.
The dynamic of every battle against terrorists involving Israel, whether in Lebanon or Gaza, elsewhere, has always been one in which Israel is almost always prevented from taking decisive action by concerns about humanitarian crises created by the terrorists or the need to preserve the chance of a two-state solution that the terrorists will never accept. Do you think that the horror of the Hamas atrocities, which have been broadcast widely and resulted in a lot of sympathy, even from, in some quarters which are not normally sympathetic to Israel. Do you think that's changed that? And not so much for Israelis, but for the West and the Biden administration?
I think there is now a catalyst, if you like, for more clarity, so that Washington in particular, and for many, many years, the peace process was a very destructive instrument in that regard. The point of it was always to promote the notion of this center, that we can converge on, and we can then do away with these other inconvenient extremist factors. And there were people even pushing that with Hamas, right? The idea that Hamas could actually, unlike the Palestinian Jihad, for instance, or unlike Hezbollah or whatever.
Robert Malley, I think, was a champion of this, wasn't he?
Absolutely. And a lot of people in Washington were buying that these guys could become, yes, they're Islamists, but basically they could become part of that. And the clarifying aspect here is that, the scale of the savagery and the barbarism and this animal behavior that you saw, I think makes it very difficult for people, not that there aren't any who are still coming out in defense of it, but or the idea of both sides and cycle of violence and all of that equivalence that we're accustomed to, but it does make it more difficult for people to do so. However, if you look at the statements that have come out, including the joint statement that was released yesterday from the White House and the various European nations, and other such similar statements. By the way, that statement does not refer to Iran by name. So to go back to the point of making sure to protect Iran from any responsibility for this, it doesn't mention Iran. It does mention about integrating the Middle East, so they're still doubling down on that policy. But it also goes back to, we need to make sure that there's always a possibility for a two-state solution. So there is an emphasis on these old dogmas, even as you see that basically this is lunacy. This is, there is no. How can you give that what we just saw a state? I mean, that's just insane. It's not, but that remains the orthodoxy of Western official.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that the Palestinian state in all but name that Hamas rules in Gaza is an illustration of what happens when you have a two-state solution, not an argument, for it.
Precisely. And then, they had this Mustafa Barghouti come on Fareed Zakaria, and comes on Fareed Zakaria's show and goes on for I don't know how long defending Hamas and that it didn't kill civilians and all kinds. There's something deeply, deeply grotesque about it. And so how long will it last? We'll see. I think there is a major decision point, and there are some positive signs that one can see in the reaction that people are having. Where do I want to stand? Am I really going to defend the beheading of Jewish babies and in my equivocation? And it does make it very uncomfortable and very difficult for people who otherwise would have been a lot more comfortable doing so. So but we'll see where that goes. Officially, on the level of policy, however, I don't see a major change in terms of the big headlines of Palestinian statehood, and all of that.
What are the chances, do you think, of Hezbollah joining in the conflict in the coming days to create a second front as Israel enters Gaza, as it appears it almost has to? I mean, certainly the Lebanese people as a whole don't want another war and the devastation that would bring to their country, but Hezbollah takes its orders from Iran, doesn't it? And that's a different dynamic.
Sure. I mean, that's the big question in terms of will they or won't they? And the last couple of days, we've seen skirmishes on the border, which has led people, made people a lot more nervous as to whether Hezbollah intends to go in or not. So I had mentioned the new provocations and the new set of rules that Hezbollah has tried to impose since 2021. Opening the Lebanese border to anonymous rocket fire, approaching the fence and making a lot of provocative action along the fence, opening up or activating the Hardov sector, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things happened since 2021. Israel, unfortunately, played along with them, again, with American prodding. One of the things we saw just now is that Israel has taken those out. So they've reversed them. So the first thing that Hezbollah tried to do on October 8th, I believe, was to try to capitalize on what it had been doing in the Hardov region and attack a position there. And the Israelis responded, and then they destroyed that outpost that the Americans told them we'll take care of with negotiations and so on. So they blew that all out. And then the next day, Hezbollah tried again with the idea of letting the Palestinians take action. So then they, a unit from I think from Islamic Jihad went into Shtula in northern Israel, and I think ended up killing a Druze senior commander in the IDF. And the Israeli forces obviously destroyed them, and then they targeted Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? So they didn't give Hezbollah a pass. They targeted Hezbollah position and observation posts along the border. In that process, they killed 3 Hezbollah fighters. Now, according to the old rules of engagement that both Israel and Hezbollah had kind of allowed to take hold, is that whenever Israel takes out Hezbollah fighters, Hezbollah retaliates in order to extract the same amount of death toll as Israel did. So that's what they've been doing now since yesterday and again today. They've been taking out, they've been attacking with rocket fire and anti-tank fire and so on. They hit with an anti-tank, I think they tried to hit a Merkava tank as well. The IDF says that there were no casualties. So do they continue to do so until they draw blood, or do they say, okay, we stop now, this round is over, and then they wait to see what happens when the ground invasion in Gaza begins, see how the IDF performs, and see what they can do to keep the IDF off balance, to try to deter it from any action there or escalated action there. Will that work? All of these are open questions, because now the element of surprise in the north is not there, right? The IDF is ready. A lot of towns have been evacuated. The IDF is in the towns. It's unclear that, and the IDF is signaling that we have every capacity to conduct operations on both fronts. So it doesn't mean that they will stop in Gaza anyway. So all of these are open questions. I think now we're just kind of waiting to see if the current skirmish stops, escalates, and then kind of evolves into something bigger or not. The Israelis, I think, are giving Hezbollah an off-ramp on the one hand, but on the other hand, like I said, they've taken away those two new gains that Hezbollah had made with American support after 2021. So that's important, and now the rest is really remains to be seen.
Right. Now, you've described very clearly how the West has sort of recognized Hezbollah and Iran's sovereignty, more or less, in Lebanon. Is a Lebanon that is not under Hezbollah and Iran's thumb a realistic possibility in the foreseeable future, or is it just a given that it remains, sort of an Iranian colony in a sense?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think it's an illusion to believe that there's any constellation of forces in Lebanon that can somehow prevail on the total Hezbollah control of the dynamics of the country, never mind its military power. So I think that's an illusion. I think it's an illusion that's beneficial to the Lebanese as well as to the United States, and to say nothing of the Iranians, because it allows for continued U.S. funding.
Of the Lebanese government, as if it is an independent force that can in some way restrain Hezbollah.
Correct. And, and they use these meaningless words like, act as a counterbalance to Hezbollah. What does that mean? What does that actually mean? What does it mean to act as a counterbalance? So the security forces assist Hezbollah. And I forget my assessment of it. Read any United Nations Security Council resolution or report on the implementation of Security Council resolutions pertaining to UNIFIL, the UN force in South Lebanon. See what they say about what the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, does. See how they say that the Lebanese Armed Forces obstruct UNIFIL missions to inspect Hezbollah sites. What do you call a force whose job it is to protect Hezbollah sites against inspection by the United Nations forces? I mean, you can use euphemism. I call it an auxiliary force. So it's so
if Hezbollah is an auxiliary of Iran, the Lebanese army is an auxiliary of Hezbollah.
Right. I mean, Hezbollah is a unit of the Revolutionary Guards, effectively, right? So, but it's the role of the institutions, so-called institutions in Lebanon, are to assist the Hezbollah order, the Hezbollah-run order, especially on security matters. If not directly assist, then sit by and say nothing. But again, I've written about this repeatedly. The United States funded, for instance, the internal security forces of Lebanon, basically the police force. These guys, since 2010, I think, until most recently in the news in 2022, these guys were rounding up suspected Israeli spy networks in Lebanon. In other words, they were running counterintelligence operations for Hezbollah, funded and equipped by the United States. Okay? When we say in the United States, when the government here says, well, we are trying to undermine Hezbollah's narrative that it is the only defender of Lebanon. Leave aside the silliness of a policy whose objective is to undermine a narrative, whatever that means. Let's parse what the narrative is. When you're saying that we are trying to undermine a narrative that it is the sole defender of Lebanon, whom does Hezbollah claim to be a defender against? Claims to be a defender against Israel. So are you saying that America's policy is to prop up the Lebanese armed forces as a defender against Israel. In that sense, it makes total sense for the American government to fund anti-Israel operations by the security forces of Lebanon. So it's not really a winning talking point for you to use that, okay? Because you're just admitting that you are willfully funding an anti-Israel operation in Lebanon, which is exactly what has been going on anyway.
Yeah, I guess the question for those of us who recall the Lebanese civil war and the long conflicts, the other communities in Lebanon, the Christian community and even the Sunni community, which presumably, resent Hezbollah and the Shia dominance, have they just given up? And, do they just accept that they are sort of, a tolerated minority there? Or is that the reality?
So it's funny you mentioned the Civil War, because the Civil War was basically the moment when the Christian community went into terminal decline. Basically, that was the dead cat's bounce, if you like. They're done. And they are done demographically. Not incidentally that I'm championing them as some sort of a
positive force, because they weren't
positive force in Lebanon or anything like that. No. I'm just describing it purely demographically, right? Because they're not a positive force. So they just demographically, they're done. So that's number one. Politically, they're all eager to cut their own deals with Hezbollah. Everyone recognizes Hezbollah's supremacy. Their job is not to replace Hezbollah. Or their desire, rather, their objective is not to replace Hezbollah. It's just to kind of be able to be given room, to sit next to it, basically on the at the table. The Sunnis were never a fighting force in Lebanon, which is why the fighting force for the Sunnis in Lebanon, or if you want, the Sunni fighting force rather in Lebanon during the war, were the Palestinians. They weren't. Yeah. It wasn't the Sunnis. The Sunnis are not a fighting force. Whenever you get a Sunni fighting force in the Levant, it usually tends to be Islamist. And so the deal that the U.S. has had with Iran, and that's something an innovation that Barack Obama figured out, and this is kind of the result of the global war on terror and the post 9/11 scene, is that America became the crusher of all Sunni Islamist movements in the region, including those that like in Syria, for instance, were actually fighting against Hezbollah, right? So we did not want. So if that was the choice, America sided with the Iranians against those guys, right? And they in Iraq, in Syria, we acted as enforcers of the Iranian order, taking those guys out. And in Lebanon, there isn't Islamist in Lebanon in any meaningful sense, right? So in a lot of people like to exaggerate Al Qaeda in Lebanon. It's nonsense. They do so in order to justify the money being poured into Lebanon, because it's the same scheme, right? Oh, the Lebanese forces are great bulwark against Sunni jihadism in Lebanon. Now, if you put that in the context of the war in Syria, when Hezbollah was using Lebanon to go into Syria and fight in Syria and wreak havoc in Syria, the Lebanese armed forces, funded, trained, equipped, and provided with intelligence by the United States, their job was to protect its flank from any blowback by those Syrian forces that they were slaughtering in Syria. So ultimately, the United States across the Levant was taken under the cover of the anti-ISIS, anti-Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call it, a war. It was taking the effective position of protecting Iranian equities.
Right. Now, how confident do you think Iran is about its position in the region? For example, a recent Department of Defense report conceded that they're only 12 days away from assembling enough fissile material to make a nuclear bomb, something that seemingly already makes them a threshold nuclear power. Do you believe that that makes them think that they can operate with impunity, and that sort of leading back to our discussion of what Hamas has done.
Right. So, I mean, we started this conversation by talking about the $16 billion that the United States gave them, right? That $16 billion is just the latest installment.
I think it was $6 billion, not 16, right?
No, there's $10 billion from Iraq as well.
Okay.
So there's $6 billion. Yeah.
Because it's usually reported as just 6. Yeah.
Well, that's the one from, I think, from South Korea. And then there's another 10 from Iraq. That's aside from the oil sales that the Biden administration has allowed them to do. And that is also aside from all the other sort of lax sanctions enforcement, their cooperation with the Chinese, their cooperation with the Russians, the sense, like I said, of protection by the United States in places like Iraq, places like Lebanon, the effective surrender of the Saudis in Yemen after being, browbeat by the United States into backing down as well. And now we've reached a place where we have basically a secret understanding between the Biden team and Iran over the nuclear program, where they've effectively conceded 60% enrichment as part of it. And that is, that's a development. And I think even in the talking points of administration officials and administration amplifiers, the idea of Iran as a sort of accepting Iran as a threshold nuclear state is kind of part of it. Now the job is to kind of just prevent a breakout, but accept that it's a threshold state. So that's the development that has happened in the last 2 years.
Yeah, where does Syria, which is obviously still reeling from a civil war that depopulated that country, placed it under Iranian occupation, where does it fit into this regional conflict? Is Assad so beholden to Iran and desirous of some credibility on the Arab street that he might risk some sort of confrontation with Israel, or is he too weak to even contemplate taking such a risk?
Yeah, his position in Syria is entirely dependent on the Iranians and the Russians. He doesn't have the capacity for any such thing. Now, he might grandstand about lending his support and approval for it, but whatever that is, it's going to be Iranian led and Russian protected. Now, prior to this war, we had a movement again, by the Arab states, by the Gulf Arab states, to try to seek normalization. It was also spearheaded by Jordan, and it was very much encouraged by the Biden administration. The idea is like, see what you can get from him and so on. But it looked favorably upon engagement with him. And also Lebanon was another backdoor for that, as they tried to orchestrate a gas and energy deal of bringing in Egyptian gas to Lebanon to help supposedly with its electricity crisis. But that would have had to be wheeled in through Jordan and then Syria and then to Lebanon. So there are sanctions on Syria, so they would have had to violate those sanctions in order for that gas to be able to pass through Syria. And this was an initiative that the administration pursued doggedly for a couple of years. And it is only because of the those strong sanctions that Congress has placed, and the fear of violating those sanctions on the part of Egypt in particular, and the World Bank not being enthusiastic about obviously sanctions, but also about the Lebanese ability to implement reforms so that they can finance such a deal. That deal has stalled. But it's not because the administration hasn't done everything in its power to try to get it through. And that would have given Assad, first of all, money. And second of all, it would have given him also, again, another sort of signal that it was open for business again, just like with the other Arab normalization efforts with him.
Well, I guess at this moment, it seems as if Hamas's actions might have changed some of the dynamic to the point where it's conceivable that the West might change its mind about eliminating the group from Gaza. Do you think, sort of very briefly, that the U.S. and the West will actually let Israel go that far?
That's another open question. John Kirby was asked specifically that question the other day, and was asked, "Is it everything, whatever it takes for basically however long it takes, whatever it takes?" He didn't answer it. He refused to answer it. He refused to say yes wherever it takes.
Yeah, so they're leaving their options open. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, right now there is no doubt that they have to signal total support for Israel, and they are sending munitions and all kinds of things. Although, I think people are exaggerating a little bit this, or more than a little bit, the significance of the naval group that was sent. I think the idea signal
that
deterrence. What does that mean?
The idea that some people are fantasizing about America getting involved is just ridiculous. That's never
absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, like, what does it mean to signal deterrence? How does it signal deterrence exactly? That if Hezbollah were to launch rockets against Israel, that the naval group would target Hezbollah? I mean, it's nonsense. So, I mean, whatever benefit there might be, in terms of intelligence gathering or whatever that could be shared with Israel, I'm not denying those things. But the notion that somehow it can deter Hezbollah from taking action is overwrought. So again, the United States is showing some measures of support, most importantly with the provision of munitions and things like that. But it is unclear what the timeline is that the administration has in mind as an acceptable timeline. Also, the messaging on Lebanon, to your earlier question, cuts at least both ways, right? Meaning that if you're saying I don't want a second front in Lebanon, that works against the Israelis as much as it does against Hezbollah, right? I mean, we don't want,
because it's a deterrence against Israel defending itself there.
We don't want the Lebanese to suffer. We don't want Lebanon to be destroyed, and so but that cuts both ways, right? That cuts against the Israelis just as much.
Well, Tony, thanks so much for joining us today and for your insights on the issues. And we'll be looking forward to reading more from you in the future at Tablet and the other outlets where you are published. I also want to thank our audience. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show.